Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Well, the Public Order Emergencies Commission is well underway. You know, the inquiry as to why the Emergencies Act was invoked. And we are a good way through the 65 witnesses who are testifying. We are hearing from local Ottawa citizens, convoy organizers and spokespersons such as Tamara Litch, Chris Barber, Tom Marazzo, as well as former Chief of Police for Ottawa, ministers Chrystia Freeland, Omar Alghabra, and even the Prime Minister. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was invited to testify, but he has declined. So far, the inquiry has been very interesting, especially in helping the public understand much of the inner discussion which led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act this past February. But will the inquiry, which is due to release its final report in February 2023, provide Canadians the answers they are looking for? Was it really necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act, to freeze the financial assets of some of the Canadians, to have many protesters arrested, to use police force to quash a public protest, albeit a large and lengthy one? And finally, what does this mean for democracy going forward? Later in the program, we will hear from Tom Marazzo, a Freedom Convoy volunteer and a retired Army officer. And now we are happy to have Andrew Lawton, who is at the hearings himself and is a senior journalist at the True North. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. Great to have you on. And I know you've had a front row seat to a lot of the appearances and a lot of the testimony, if you will, at the inquiry. So what has surprised you most of the hearings so far?
To be honest, there haven't been any real bombshells. I think what surprised me is just how clear cut the evidence has been that pretty much everyone involved in this, from a policing perspective, everyone involved from the various levels of government, was all saying effectively the same thing, which was that this was a generally peaceful protest. And more importantly, that they didn't think the Emergencies Act was necessary. And in some cases, that it wasn't even used.
So is that not in and of itself a bombshell? Because I think many Canadians, might have empathy for the Prime Minister saying, well, things are getting out of hand. We hear all these news reports at the time, concerns about weapons, concerns about violence, a lot of ruckus downtown Ottawa. Maybe he was justified in it. So is that not a bombshell in of itself to suggest that, it actually everything was pretty peaceful?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I guess if you were watching in February CBC's coverage exclusively, it probably is a bombshell. If you were getting your sense of what was happening from the government's media conferences and briefings, then yes, it would be a bombshell. But I think for a lot of Canadians who were following this themselves, either through independent media or being on the ground, or even just taking a more open mind about what was happening, it isn't going to be a huge surprise at all. And I think that when you look at the evidence that's come forward in the inquiry, one thing that really is driven home is how good the relationship was between convoy organizers and the city of Ottawa in those few days before the Emergencies Act was put in place. And they actually had a deal that was shrinking the footprint of the protest in Ottawa, and that the federal government knew about that and disregarded it when deciding to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Wow, well, that's quite telling. Now, you for those who may not have seen your coverage, you were live reporting at times from the actual front line of the convoy, if you will, right from Ottawa. I remember you were right in the midst of it. And you were there when those extreme measures were brought in to quash the protest. Has the government so far, now I know we haven't heard from some of the more senior officials, but do you anticipate the government will provide good justification for that based on what you've heard in the past few days?
That's going to be the big question. And I should say, just as a procedural note, there are going to be two senior officials from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, who are testifying. And their testimony is not going to be public. It's going to be testimony that takes place in an empty room before only the commissioner. And the commissioner is going to decide after hearing it if some of it or all of it can be released to the public. So if there is something very damning in that evidence, the Canadian public won't hear it. They might just hear that there was something there. But ultimately, we've heard from people who were responsible for briefing federal ministers and briefing the prime minister. And even then, we really haven't heard anything that justifies the message that was being disseminated publicly by those senior political officials.
My goodness. And yes, so far in the testimony, you're right. We've heard about how there was a thought of bringing the Emergencies Act. but things were already being cleared up at the Windsor border, at Coots, in various forms. So we're going to have to unpack a little bit more of this right when we return from this commercial break. Stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing the Emergencies Act and the inquiry surrounding that, whether the government was justified in using that tool, if you will, to quash the Freedom Convoy earlier this year in February 2022. Joining me again is Andrew Lawton, author and senior journalist at True North. Andrew, the protest took place in Ottawa. Ottawa's in Ontario. There were border blockades in Windsor. Windsor's in Ontario. Yet the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has refused to appear. He was invited to, but he's refused to appear in front of the inquiry, in front of the commission. Do you think he should be compelled?
Well, I should say he wasn't just invited, he was subpoenaed and fought that subpoena in court and ended up, for rather bizarre reasons, being successful in that. I think absolutely he should have, forgetting the legal issue of whether he should be compelled to or could have been compelled to, I think just as a matter of moral and political leadership, he should have been there. Not only because this protest affected him in his province, but because he was one of the only, actually the only premier that took in a very enthusiastically supportive view of the Emergencies Act, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, was saying he stood shoulder to shoulder with Justin Trudeau on the Emergencies Act. So why not answer why it was necessary? Why not answer to the question of why your existing authorities, your existing agencies were unable to deal with this problem in the absence of the Emergencies Act? I think it's quite disgraceful that he is not willing to own up to that under oath.
Well, and to his credit, the Prime Minister is appearing, and he's going to stand to answer questions, and I appreciate that. I can't imagine what he will say to justify his using of such a draconian measure. We shall see. But I agree. Premier Ford should stand and answer to the people. He just faced an election. We deserve to hear that voice. I think so. Now, do you think we can look at both the Prime Minister and Doug Ford. Will this harm Doug Ford's reputation as a premier of the people, as he likes to build himself? Do you think that will impact him and his reputation going forward? Will the people stand for this?
It's interesting. One of the things that I found fascinating from some of the documents that have been tabled, which I wouldn't say were necessarily explosive, but they were illuminating, is how, well, publicly Doug Ford was backing up Justin Trudeau. Privately, Justin Trudeau was speaking very negatively about Doug Ford. At one point, he was calling him a coward. At another point, he was trying to get in a phone call between the two of them, Doug Ford, to start directing police. And Ford was saying, well, no, I can't do that. And, if we want to go in there and kick butt, yeah, it's not my role. So it was like the federal government expected Doug Ford to be doing a lot more than he was. And that loyalty that seemed to go from the Ontario government to the federal government was not reciprocated.
Oh, very interesting. So, given what you've heard so far, do you think the government will be successful in proving to the public that the Emergencies Act was justified? Because, we could look at things technically, but at the end of the day, there is an ethical, a moral takeaway from all of this. People want to have trust and faith in the government that they acted properly and they were measured in their response. Do you think that will be the outcome here?
I think that people need to lower expectations for the reason that the commissioner's report, even if it's very scathing against the federal government, doesn't actually come with any accompanying legal or political remedy. It's incumbent upon members of parliament, it's incumbent upon Canadians to take whatever they learn from this and push for some form of accountability. There's not going to be a scathing indictment that triggers a resignation or an expulsion or some fine of some kind. So I think in that sense, the process is what people should be focused on. It's why I've been covering it. I think sharing clips of what's happening in these proceedings, because at the very least, this is a fact-finding operation for Canadians as much as it is for the commission. And I think it's important that Canadians judge for themselves. They don't need a commissioner to tell them what they can see with their own eyes through the course of this testimony.
Well, and you, of course, have helped, I guess you could say, shape or provide more insight. You published a book earlier this year, a very successfully published book on the Freedom Convoy, Andrew. And you provided a lot of interview information, a lot of your insights in this. You only kind of heard one side of the story, and obviously you're hearing a little bit more from the government. Have you personally gained more information that you found interesting that would color your book a bit more if there was a second edition?
Yeah, so I mean, I've actually, I should say, I've been very grateful that at a few points the commission's lawyers have been citing my book. So it's a bit of an endorsement of the credibility of it that is being used in the official evidence. I've learned some more of the context, and I never pretended that my book was going to have every aspect from every angle covered. I didn't, for example, focus on the law enforcement aspect or the city of Ottawa's aspect. So I've learned a fair bit that really rounds out the other players that weren't part of the scope about whom I was writing initially. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to do a second edition, but if I did, there certainly is some more information, definitely.
Okay, well, Andrew, good luck to you as you continue to cover this commission. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the Public Order Emergencies Commission, or as I like to call it, the Emergencies Act Inquiry. And joining me now is Tom Marazzo. He's actually one of the persons who've appeared before the commission, and he was a Freedom Convoy volunteer and also is a retired Army officer. Thank you, Tom, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, so yes, that's right. You have been on once before. Now,
Yeah.
you know, for those of who may not know you, although you're pretty famous across the country now, is how did you get involved with the convoy?
I was following the convoy on social media, just like everybody else, and I received a phone call from a friend of mine who asked me if I would take a phone call with somebody who was one of the original people involved in the convoy. And so, because I lived only a couple of hours from Ottawa, I took the phone call thinking that I would just give a little bit of advice in terms of logistics and some of the things that probably needed to happen while they were trying to do a sustainment plan in Ottawa. But turns out about 3 hours later, it was easier for me to just go there. And as a result, I ended up staying for about 22 days.
My goodness. So what compelled you to stay? Why was it important for you to participate and volunteer?
Well, the work was too important. And strangely enough, my job while I got there actually started to evolve. Every couple of days, things would change. And it just seemed that I was very suited for the role that I ended up finding myself in. And of course, then Eva and Keith, so Eva Chipiuk and Keith Wilson, who are also here at the commission, I worked with them on a daily basis once they arrived. So my role started to evolve as time went on. And so that's why I just kept staying. And there was days where I wondered, like, have I outlived my usefulness, or should I just move on and make space for somebody else? But my role just kept evolving.
Now, you appeared before the commission, and you spoke beautifully. And I think it's important for our viewers that they understand a little bit what issues really compelled you to participate. Why was it important to you personally that you participate in the convoy as a volunteer? And also, why was it important that you appear before the commission?
Well, for all the years, the 2 years plus leading up to the convoy, there was just no opportunity to fight back on that scale because the government of Canada, the province of Ontario, even municipal governments were just absolutely masterful at segregating and isolating people to make them deliberately feel like they were alone and had no voice.
And
And
this
I,
is
and I
during
remember
COVID.
during COVID, and I remember the chief medical officer, I think of Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, one of them. I watched an interview with him, and he said he wanted to make sure that people were locked down over the Christmas holidays so that people couldn't gather and have conversations about COVID and the restrictions and the mandates. So they were deliberately trying to make sure people could not have conversations and question the authorities.
Wow.
And I believe that to be the case here in Ontario as well. But there was a moment in my life where, as a retired officer, I spoke about this during my testimony, is that for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of the police in my own country, just as a free citizen, because they were handing out, terrible fines. They were arresting people for the most minor infractions with the masks. People were just going absolutely crazy with fear, and their fear led to some really horrendous actions, and then overactions or reactions from the police. And it seemed like everybody had lost their minds. And so I had this constant pit in my stomach of fear living in this country. And I have a relative who her son died in a motorcycle accident, and only 10 people were allowed to go to the funeral. It was a drive-by funeral, but they only allowed 10 immediate family. And if you hear the stories about all the people that died alone in long-term care facilities or died in hospitals. I mean, when I campaigned with the Ontario Party, every time I went out and did an event, it was just all of the carnage that we would have to listen to of all the families that were out there, right across Ontario, and they all felt like they were alone. And that's the other common thing. There was a lot of carnage, and there was a lot of people that felt like nobody else out there understood them. And so the government was masterful at making us feel alone.
And
But when
so,
that
and so your response, if you will, to that, or you felt compelled then, you know what, I need to do something. And then all of a sudden there was this spontaneous almost convoy and you said, I'll join right in.
Yeah, and for me, I was playing the gray man in public. I just didn't want to draw attention to myself. I
Okay,
know
I'm going
how
to
this.
pause you there, Tom. We're going to open this up just in a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing as I like to call it, the Emergencies Act Inquiry, but as it's formally known, the Public Order Emergencies Commission. And joining me is Tom Marazzo, a Freedom Convoy volunteer who himself appeared before the commission. Tom, before commercial break, we were discussing of what compelled you to participate in this convoy and why you felt it was personally necessary for you in particular to stand up and do something. Please carry on.
Well, I was for the first 2 years really being the gray man, and that's kind of an army term for just blending in and not being seen and not drawing attention to yourself. But there was something different about this convoy. It was the golden opportunity that allowed millions of Canadians to finally realize two things. One, they weren't alone. Two, there was an opportunity to be a loud voice. And so for me, the moment I was asked to participate in that convoy, I just immediately recognized it for what it was. This was the chance for Canadians to do something monumental, very substantive, to push back against the government overreach. And so it was as simple as just recognizing the opportunity that I had to do something productive based on my skills that I gained from 25 years in the military.
Now, you, as I mentioned, have appeared before the commission. Um, really briefly, could you explain what happens in this commission? You were called to testify. Is it virtual? Is it in person? How did that go?
So it is all in person and it is ongoing. I am here at the library and the archive building in Ottawa right now. The inquiry is still ongoing. This week it's all about the CSIS, RCMP, and the intelligence community. That's who's testifying now. But I did testify about 2 weeks ago, and several of the people that participated in the convoy with me, like Keith Wilson, for example, is one that also testified, and Danny Bulford. And then
Yes.
we have other people that also testified that week. Pat King did. Tamara had a chance. Chris Barber had a chance to testify. But the important thing for people to understand is this is not a courtroom. This is not a lawsuit or criminal charges. This is an inquiry. And so it's a very different thing. We haven't ever done this before because the Emergency Act has never been triggered since its inception in 1990 or 88, sorry. So this has never been done before. And the purpose of this is to examine the actions of the federal government in why they invoke the Emergency Act. We, as a convoy, are not the ones that are under examination. It's
Mhm.
actually Justin Trudeau and his cabinet who made the decision to trigger the Emergency Act. So right now, there's about 20 different law firms involved in this or people that have standing. And it's interesting because there's only about 5 of the 20 that are actually focused on why we're here, which is the Emergency Act. The other 15 are just passing a hot potato around, trying to cover their butts and make sure they don't get sued for their part of the participation. Sorry, I should say 14 because there is one group that is suing the Freedom Convoy for $306 million,
This is
and that's
the citizens of Ottawa.
yeah, and Paul Champ is suing us for $306 million because of
Okay.
the. So what this commission is really about is to examine whether or not the government had the right to use the Emergency Act. And the acid test for this is, did you meet any of the 4 conditions of the CSIS Act Section 2? And if you met any of those four conditions, you're actually allowed to use the Emergency Act. But we've seen over and over and over the testimony saying, no, you've never met any one of those four conditions. So therefore, the justification for the Emergency Act doesn't exist. And the longer
Well,
I sit in
although we know CSIS, as you mentioned rightfully, is going to be presenting or speaking representatives, but that's all going to be in camera. You and I won't understand or hear what was said, only the judge leading the commission. So perhaps they will satisfy the requirement. We just won't know about it.
And it's an interesting thing because I've thought about that myself, and there's kind of two sides to this. And I agree, they could come up with some surprise evidence that nobody is aware of. But here's the thing: if that is the case, then that surprise intelligence information is not against the convoy. It's actually against individual actors
Right.
or maybe foreign bodies. It won't have anything to do with us. And so therefore their use of the Emergency Act against a peaceful protest is now a totally different issue. The second piece to that is we've seen so many people come out and say, no, that you didn't meet the threshold of Section 2 of the CSIS Act. So now how could the intelligence community or the RCMP come back and say otherwise? Because
Okay.
there's also another commission going on, and they've all said they didn't need the Emergency Act.
We're out of time, Tom, but we're going to check in with you in a few weeks. Thanks so much for being here today.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Grenick-Allen.